Okay, so we're going to start off by kind of getting you introduced to the whole workflow of Grasshopper, how it integrates with Rhino, and the interface as well. So you can get Grasshopper two different ways. This is if you want to start to get it through Rhino 6. What's great about this website too is that there's plenty of different tutorials. If you click on this link, you can start to see that there's a lot of good intro videos, YouTube videos, um, documents, books, all sorts of great resources to cover a much more extensive amount of Grasshopper information beyond what I'll be showing. You can also download it by going to Rhino 3D and going to the download section. And if you're using Rhino 5, again, you're going to have to download it as a separate software versus Rhino 6. That will be integrated into the software. So all you do is have to click on this. It'll ask for your email, enter that, and that'll begin the download process and the instructions on how to get it set up and installed. Once you've done that, we can go to Rhino here, and to get the plugin working, you just type Grasshopper. This will prompt that software to begin. Mine has a lot of plugins built into it already, so it takes a little bit longer for this one, but yours should take much quicker than mine. You can see these are a lot of the different plugins that kind of cause it to take a while, but here's our interface for Grasshopper. So there's a couple things we'll talk about, just how these two softwares are interacting with each other, all these different tools as well. So again, Grasshopper is this parametric modeling tool. It allows you to either take existing Rhino geometry, so things that you've actually already made, and allows you to bring that into Grasshopper and edit, or you could create your own geometry and information in Grasshopper and what they like to call bake it into the Rhino platform. So let's look at a couple things here. You'll see that you've got these kind of sections here, which give you all sorts of different, what they refer to as components. In Grasshopper, you'll hear the name components, widgets, all sorts of different names for these different tools. I usually refer to them as components. So the first kind of section with the parameters is basically how you start to bring in physical geometry from Rhino into Grasshopper, and what you basically do is reference that information. There's a lot of different calculations that you can start to do, essentially treating it like a mathematical equation. That's why you have things like domains, operations, trigonometry, and other mathematical components. There's sections where you start to look at ways to manipulate and alter the data. It starts off by looking then at points and vectors and forces, curves, surfaces, meshes. So they're all the different ways you can start to both kind of analyze it and then start to either create or transform these things. And we'll go over more of this through the process, but this just kind of gives you a layout of all these things. So let's just start off by kind of getting these two programs to start. So I'll just create a physical geometry for now. So let's just create a cube. Change this to be shaded so I can see it a little bit better. So again, in order to bring this information into Grasshopper, we have to make sure we select the right geometry components. So you can see that there are specific components for the different geometries. So points, vectors, curves, planes, and shapes as well. So if I decide to use this point and say set one point, it's not going to actually let me choose that. I have to select the correct one. So in this case, I usually, for any three-dimensional geometry like this, I just go to the B-rep, which is kind of a generic component that you can reference. You can reference almost anything into a B-rep. So now you can select it, and now you can see that there's a physical geometry still there that I can select and move around. But then there's also this red kind of box around it as well. So if I select it, it turns green. That helps you know that you've selected it. In Rhino, I can take this and type hide, so I don't have to actually see that geometry. I can't really move it anymore because there's nothing to select, but I do have this reference cube in there, and I can start to move it in Grasshopper, but that takes a little bit more effort. But what's great, again, if you have that, if I want to show it to bring that back, if I want to alter it, move it around, I can change the shape, and that reference will continue to stick within that component. But if I were to delete this, then I see that this turns yellow. It's no longer able to do anything because it doesn't recognize what's happened to that. So be careful not to actually delete it in Rhino. It's good to either hide it or put it on a layer that you can turn off. So these are the different components. We can then start to do a couple other things. Let's say you don't want to have that physically in there anymore, or some type of physical geometry representing it. We can actually take this and right click and say internalize data. So now it's basically embedding this geometry into that component. Now I can actually delete it and it's still represented in there. So it starts to make your overall Grasshopper file a little bit larger, but it allows you to kind of start to embed things more into Grasshopper. So let's say we take this and now we actually want there to be a physical geometry back in Rhino, because again, I can't actually select this or do anything with it, but I can, like I mentioned earlier, bake this back into Rhino. So if I right click and click bake, it'll ask me which layer I wanted to bake onto. Let's choose a different layer, hit OK. And now you can again see that I have my new geometry. But again, it's not the one that's same reference. So if I want to, again, go back to referencing this, I can right click, say the brep, and now again, it goes back to referencing that for any purposes. It's red just because that layer is now red. It's a little bit harder to see that box, so you can always put on a different layer. So it's a little bit easier to see the difference. So again, there you go. So let's just go ahead and hide this. There's different ways in which the interface that you can kind of see the quality of the geometry that's being referenced. If I make this a little bit smaller, it doesn't make, probably won't see a huge difference right now, but I can start to actually affect the kind of quality of that. Like I said, there's not a whole lot going on, but you'll see in some cases geometry might look a little odd. So for example, like I said, you can make geometry in Rhino and bring it into Grasshopper, or you can create geometry in Grasshopper and manipulate it from there. So we can see here, I've added this sphere. Let's just make it a little bit bigger, and I'll cover this a little bit later, but you can see that the sphere looks kind of low quality. It looks very kind of triangulated and has some rough edges. And this is what I was referring to. You can even see that there's kind of the actual curve of the sphere, but this looks much more rigid. If I were to change the quality, you can start to see that that looks better. And this is just a display setting. It has nothing to do with the geometry itself. It's just a matter of kind of managing the file so it doesn't start to lag, because the more and more you do to things, the more heavy and lagging the software will start to become. So it's really just kind of a nice way to manage the file. So let's spend a couple seconds on this other kind of major piece with Grasshopper. A big thing that you use Grasshopper are these sliders to manipulate things. In this case, you can see I plugged it into here, which is the radius, so I can start to alter the radius or the size of this geometry. You can find the default slider by going back to parameters, input, use number slider, You can see it just gives you a default 3 decimal slider between 0 and 1. So obviously these are much smaller, and you can see that this one that I created is a little bit bigger. So if you want, you can just edit it this way by double clicking on it. You can change the type of rounding. So if you want the decimal points, you can keep it on this. If you want it to be whole numbers, you can move to the integers, as well as these other settings. And then you can change the minimum and maximum values. So the minimum could be a negative value, it can be positive. You can do it that way where you're just kind of clicking and holding and dragging it. You can always just kind of click this to change that to be positive, and the max will always be just slightly larger than that. You can change the range itself, so it could just start at that, and you can start to alter it that way. So this kind of gives you that range, and it'll add whatever that difference is. You can choose where that starts. That's one way to do it. I think that's a little bit tedious, so there are a couple shortcuts to get away from that. If you know that you want that slider to be between different values, you can do a couple things. If you want it to be somewhere between 0 and 10, you can really just enter any number between 2 and 10, and it'll create a slider. So I'm just going to, in this case, double click the screen to create that. I'll hit 3. Now I have a number slider and whole numbers between 0 and 10. If you want something slightly larger, so between 0 and 100, I'll hit anywhere after 10 and between 100. So I could do something like 28, right? So because I'm entering whole numbers, that's all the slider is going to recognize. However, I can get even more detailed with that. What if I want something that has 2 decimal points and is between a certain range, and maybe I actually want that slider to start at a certain value. So I can do something like 5 less than, let's say, 12.25. So I have 2 decimal points less than 30. Now it'll create a number slider that's got 2 decimal points. That's going to be between the range of 5 and 30. So that's much easier than just going to the default piece and changing all those values. If you start to add that other information, it makes it a little bit easier. And that's where you can just set a starting value. You can do something obviously like 0.5 less than 15. So again, I have one with decimal, one with whole number integers, but it'll still just keep that 1 decimal between that. So it's kind of a much easier way to create these sliders that way. So these sliders are also going to be a really important component to your overall Grasshopper script. You'll also see whether you're creating your own or you're seeing other people creating scripts that you might want to use. There's a couple different ways that you can display these components. Right now, they're basically set up to read as the name. So eval, sometimes you'll see scripts where it has the icon. So it's important to kind of know that you can choose your own preference to see which one works. So if I go to display and say draw icons, now instead of it being in words, it'll show that icon. Sometimes it's easier when you see other people's scripts where it's like, it shows that symbol, and it's easier to find that than trying to find it yourself. Another good way to kind of find these components, because you can see that there's quite a lot of different components, but as you start to become more and more familiar with it, you'll know the names of things. And if you want to do that, you can start to just type in. So I'm going to double click, I'll say scale, then I get a couple options, so I can start to kind of play with it this way. So maybe I want to start to manipulate this geometry. Another thing to be aware of is that if the component's working, it's going to be gray. If it needs something, it's going to look orange. And then if you give it a value or an input that's incorrect, then it'll most likely turn it red. So in this case, if this is a curve, it's asking for, again, I could probably even just use a brep again. And again, I'll just create a cube and say set1 brep, because I can still do that. But again, it's asking for a curve. So that's why it turns red, because this is a 3D object. It's asking for a curve. So that's also something. You can usually get these things that tell you why it's not working. So data conversion failed from brep to curve, which is no surprise. So you'll notice too, as I start to kind of go through this process, is that you really kind of work with these scripts going from left to right. And that's the basic kind of function of this workflow. I'll manipulate a couple more things to this just to give you a better idea. So again, if I want to do a scale factor of 20, you'll know that this is really not doing a whole lot more than what I was doing previously. I'm really kind of just manipulating the same thing, but this is just to get you an idea of how this works. Notice that I've taken this sphere and I've scaled it up, but I still see both of these geometries, right? Think of these scripts and these operations as kind of like Photoshop, where you have a history brush. It's basically going to work from left to right, showing every action you've taken. So there's the first kind of component where I've created a shape and with a radius, and then it's also going to the next one. For the most part, you're really going to be looking for the end result, which is going to be the component furthest to the right. So you really don't need to see this initial geometry. There might be obviously some circumstances where you will, but for the most part, you probably don't want to see that. So when you start to see this geometry overlapping, it's good to start to turn off components. So I can hit preview, right click, and just turn off preview. So now I don't see that anymore. Now I just have my most recent one. And you can see that the component turns a little bit darker and gray. There's a couple different ways to do this. Sometimes you want to disable components, so you can even just disable them. Now they go to this really kind of darker gray, show that it's not even functioning. But that's how you can start to also operate these. If you don't like to right click on these, you can always just select it and hit the space bar. It'll bring up this wheel of a bunch of different things. So you can bake it. It'll bake to whatever that default layer is set to. You can enable it, disable it. You can turn it on, turn it off, and a couple other things. So those are another kind of ways to use the workflows, hitting spacebar to get a couple things. You can select all these, hit spacebar, and also begin to group things together. So that way you don't have to move every single one, but you can just actually select this bounding box and it'll move everything. And if you want to get rid of that, or if you want to change it, I can double click it. It'll change this more kind of organic shape. There's this one which is a little bit tighter. Or if I double click, it'll go back to that other thing. Or if you just want to get rid of it, you can select it and hit delete. So that's, again, just kind of a way to organize things. The last thing I'll cover with this is that when you're looking at these components, notice that there's an input and then there's an output. Sometimes it's difficult to understand what it's looking for, so it's sometimes good to just kind of hover over it and it'll tell you what it's looking for. So geometry, again, it could be curves, it could be objects, doesn't really matter. The center, so you'll notice that the icon's a little bit different. It's got this X in the middle of it. So this works off of a point. So if I, again, look at geometry, there's the point. So that's how it works off of scaling it from a certain spot, is basically from a point. And then factor, you can see that it says 0.1, so it's looking for a numeric value. So that's what starts to help you. And then the output's the actual geometry. And then it also gives you a transformation output, which helps you if you want to repeat a transformation for something else. So it kind of replicates that. So it's always good to kind of just hover over these if you're confused as to what they're doing. So that's enough to, I think, start to get you familiar with this interface. These scripts can start to get pretty large, so it's really important to make sure that you're organizing it. A lot of times, if there's things that I know I want to refer back to as these become more and more complex, I like to just go ahead and hit Control G for some of these to highlight things like, oh yeah, this is something I'm going to manipulate throughout the process. So there's all sorts of ways of where you can kind of highlight things and help you remember what it is that you want to manipulate future further into that project. So again, hopefully this gets you just a little bit more familiar with the whole interface through this introductory video.